Just me. Great. We'll talk about that later. I'll tell you this. What's funny about these things, this is kind of a little bit what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about all different kinds of relationships. And the thing about your relationships is they started like one way, like when you were a kid. You know this too. Like I remember like you have all of these like friendships as you're a kid. They continue to morph because you morph. And then at some point along the way, you start like being interested in the opposite sex. And then all of a sudden there's those relationships. How many of you remember middle school where you went out with somebody but never went anywhere? Did anybody do that? Never went anywhere, nor did you talk, and you were trying to explain that to people. I remember explaining to my mom that I was asking a girl out in 6th grade, and she goes, "You don't drive." And we ended up with this long conversation about it's not going out, it's going out. And she was like, "You're dumb." Anyway, so there's a little bit of that. You know, there's like this kind of moment. And you have these moments, and you have this with your friendships too. And your friendships kind of progress. Like your best friend in college isn't usually the wisest friend that you've ever had. It's the friend that you made some memories with that now you regret, and kind of regret. You know, like there's a little bit of that. And you have all of these work relationships too. I mean, it continues to morph and evolve. But the one thing that's constant, and it's been constant since you were a kid, is that all of your relationships to some degree are a little bit messy. Am I right? Like they're a little bit messy, and they're messy not because of just the relationship, right? We talk about this a lot, but like the messiness in your friendships or your marriage relationships, your dating relationships, isn't the relationship's fault. The mess in them is kind of the people in it. You know what I mean? There's something about you as a person, there's something about the other people that you're in relationships with where it's always a little bit messy. And then we talk about this too, like, you know, other people contribute to the mess. Like other people are always kind of contributing to this. But the other truth is this, so do you, right? You also contribute to the mess as well. Like there's a piece of you that brings all of your kind of messiness. The other person's bringing all of their messiness, and all of a sudden you get to the place in a friendship or a dating relationship or a marriage, or if you're a leader in the room and you're leading the people that you're leading, it gets messy. And I love the best illustration I've ever seen about it is like these two cups. If you're going to take two plastic cups and they're filled with like beads, at some point there's going to be tension. And as soon as there's tension, as soon as those two people kind of bump up against each other and do that, all of a sudden it gets messy. Everything spills out, and it's just messy, right? Relationships get messy. And then you think about this, especially when it comes to marriage, but you thought like, hey, once I get married, it'll get maybe a little bit easier because we're committed to each other. But then what really happened is you got married, and a month in or 3 months in or 9 months in or 12 years in, whatever that stuff was that was over here, it wasn't that it got less. It's like somebody put a magnifying glass on whatever that brokenness was, and it came out in a fight, or it came out in a series of fights, and it just got kind of messy. And what happens around that is really centered around both our decisions and the decisions that other people have kind of made in our friendships as well. Now, what we're going to do today, and this is where we're going to spend the next like 3 weeks, is we're going to spend time talking about the important relationships in your life. Some of this is going to be about dating. Some of this is going to be about marriage. A lot of this is going to be about friendships. For those of you who are leaders in the room, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about all these principles as it applies to leadership as well. But at the guts of this, at the core of this, is really two primary statements that will sort of lead us to where we're going, and that's this. That your present decisions will become the past that you remember, right? Your present decisions, especially if it comes around relationships, it will become the past that you remember, and ultimately either one day tell stories about, or be really honest about it, or one day you lie a little bit about to make it sound better, right? There's usually that freshman year of college where there's a handful of experiences where you leave out just a few of the details, right? There's a little bit of that where you go like, you're going to have the past, and you're creating that now. And then the second one is this, that your present decisions will create the future that you experience as well, right? What you're doing right now, right? The experiences that you have now are shaping the course and the direction of your life when it comes to your relationships, when it comes to your friendships, when it comes to your marriage. All of it's centered around how you're responding now in the moment. Now, we said this already, but we said this. There really aren't any relationship problems that we're talking about. Really, what we're going to be talking about over the next three weeks is this. It's going to be people who have problems, or people with problems, who are in a relationship, right? Now, there's a principle around this that's kind of like, I want to send this off into the practical parts of the series with the principle around this. Most of us are brought up with some sort of like idea or, you know, thought pattern around, we've got to find the right person, right? You remember this? Most every fairy tale is around this. You're like a little girl, you know this too. You're watching whatever Disney movie and they're finding the prince. There's not 9 princes. There is a prince, and he looks like, you know, whatever, like he I don't know what that is, but yeah, I don't know. He looks like that. You got the prince. That'd be a weird looking prince. I don't know. And you got that, but you're finding the friends, yeah, sort of thing. And I'll tell you what this, and this is what's so fascinating. From the time that we're a kid, you get into most every love story that you've ever seen. You get into even most like heroic stories that you look at and that you see. You're finding like your people, you're finding the right person, you're finding the right job, you're finding all of these sorts of things. Very little is said in most of the things that we entertain ourselves with around becoming the right person. Most of the focus ends up being around finding the right person versus becoming the right person. Now, that seems overly simple, and I know that it's a little bit overly simple, but at the end of the day, at the core of all of this isn't just everybody else that you're looking at. It's not all the mess with everybody else. We're going to spend time looking inward first and going like, hey, what does it look like to become the right person in these places? So I put in my notes, I said it this way: that finding the right person without becoming the right person will likely yield to an unhealthy relationship, or it'll likely yield to you finding somebody who might even be the right person or the right job or the right friend, and then all of a sudden you enter in a relationship without dealing with the things that you need to deal with, and you get into it, and it becomes unhealthy, not because of the other person, but sometimes because of what we bring to it. And so the question, I'll say this, if you're like a bottom line up front person, this is gonna be the question that we like ask over the next 3 weeks in different ways. And I'll say this: are you the person that you wish other people to be? All right? Are you the person that you wish other people to be? At the end of the day, are you the person that you wish other people to be like? Now, what's interesting about the scriptures, and I'll tell you this, there is no like place in the Bible that talks about how to find the right person. There's just not. There's not a lot of space in here. There's not even a lot of time devoted to like, hey, here's what it looks like to find the right person, or like, you know, what it looks like to find the one. There's really not any of that. But you have all sorts of places all over the New Testament that talks about what it looks like to become this person. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give you a list. So there's a list in the New Testament that talks about this, and this list that's talked about is really hard for me to speak on. So I'll just be really upfront with you. This is one of the hardest passages in all of the Bible, I think, to talk about because of how familiar you are with it, right? Most of us have been to a wedding when somebody said something along the lines of love is patient, love is... Oh, so you get it. So you already know. Some of you are not even Christians. You're like, I know that part. I hate that part of the wedding. You know what I mean? There's a little bit of that. Or your grandmother like had this stitched into like a Precious Moments thing, and it sits in the bathroom somewhere. Like there's a little bit of this where like you know this text and what it looks like. And what's so hard about this, and I'm just telling you up front because I want you to feel sorry for me as we teach it. I don't know. Yeah, there's a piece of you that goes like, I could tell you this over and over again. You've heard it so many times, and at my problem with it is it wasn't written in the cheesy sort of way that you've been given it, right? It wasn't written without any teeth to it. It wasn't written in 2023 as a bumper sticker kind of thing. It wasn't written that way. In fact, the guts around this are really like passionate. They're really kind of hard to look at. It was written to a group of people who were really struggling at certain parts of their story. And it was written by a guy who has a fascinating story, who was extraordinarily educated, ended up franchising the local church in a lot of ways all over the ancient world. He likely spoke multiple languages. He's a person that came up in a system of religion, and this is so interesting, where the religion and the political structures, they weren't divorced. They were very deeply connected, and he was the guy that essentially just kind of moved through the ranks. Like he would have been the guy that was extraordinarily good at checking the boxes, and then he got to a place, and this is what a lot of people don't talk about with this, where he was actually a part of organizing sort of the persecution around some of the people who were followers, what they say, followers of the way. And they were viewing this followers of the way thing as almost, in some ways, like a political insurrection of some ways, where it was like, this person came to this sort of thing, and we've got to like crush this sort of thing that's going on. And he was a part of some of that. And he wasn't writing just to have something on a wall, and he wasn't writing to a group of people where it was all just like Feely and a Nicholas Sparks novel. It wasn't, I mean, nothing against Nick, but there's a little bit, sorry, we're on a first name basis. There's a little bit of this where you just go like, it wasn't that. It was written by this guy who had those moments, extraordinarily intelligent, and then comes to this like powerful way of finding the person of Jesus. Not an out there set of ideas, not even a new religion. He meets the person of Jesus and completely goes the opposite direction than where he was going. And what he does is he begins to launch all of these like ancient sort of like churches all over the ancient world, and then he starts writing to them. So a big chunk of the New Testament is his letters to these people who are trying to figure out how to navigate their life amidst persecution, or in the midst of like kind of pulling away from some of their religious roots, or people who are like in a completely different camp altogether. And he's writing them and going like, hey, this is what it means to be a follower of the way, or specifically a follower of Jesus. And so this love is patient, love is kind sort of section isn't written for you to feel good. It's actually written in the guts of what it looks like to have a painful and messy experience with other human beings. And so with that, we'll start with, well, love is patient. All right, love is kind. Now, let's talk about this. The love is patient part is so fascinating. So in the context of this, he's writing to a group of people in an area of the world called Corinth, and there's a piece of this where you go like, patience, I'll be really honest, I have very little, right? Let me ask you this. How many of you are naturally patient people? Like you just, I want to see where the good humans are real fast. Yeah. How many of you are like me and you like have so little patience, it's unbelievable. Like, yeah, you get frustrated at fast food restaurants sometimes. So there's a little bit of that. Yeah. So there's a piece of me that I just go like, how many of you are in the middle? You're like, sometimes I'm patient. Yeah. So yeah. Which really means you're impatient. You just want a minute. That's great. No, I'm just totally kidding. I'm totally kidding. But there's a piece of you that's like, hey, when it comes to the patience thing, I'll be honest. I do a lot of weddings and stuff. I'll read this at weddings. People ask me to read it. And I'll get to this part, and I was like, I don't even like saying it out loud. Like, love is patient? Sometimes. Anyway, like it's a little bit, I don't feel that. And at the core of how this like is written, how this starts, it is like love actually like waits. And love sometimes moves at the speed of the other person. And the practice of this is actually really difficult. Love says, hey, there is a speed and a capacity that you move at. And I'm going to, at times, defer to that. Like, love pushes me, right, to create more space and more time than I had planned on with you. Now, you see this when it comes to, like, working sort of stuff, too. Like, if you're a leader, you know this. There's an urgency to a lot of leaders. And the urgency to that is like towards progress or towards moving forward or these kinds of things. But what you also know is this, that urgency or that lack of patience, what it oftentimes can do is cause you to view the person in front of you for what they can contribute and what they can produce and what they can do, and it dehumanizes them to a degree. Now, this happens in marriage too. Come on, you know this too. In marriage, the times that I view my wife as an object is generally happening when I am not patient, right? I'm viewing something from what I want or what we needed to do, this kind of thing, and it's very rarely out of viewing her own humanity. I don't want to wait for you to catch up to what I want to do. I dehumanize you by lack of patience. And this is one of those things you go like, it's not about just going, hey, I'm going to be calm when we're rushed. It's not about that. It's so much more. It's about the humanity of the individual and at the guts of your heart saying, am I willing to wait or move at the speed that causes us to have the healthiest relationship? Now, the next part is even worse for me, right? So this is where it's like the love is patient thing, great, but the kindness part, like love is kind. Now come on, you can say this, and you know this. We are kinder in person than we are online, but who most of us kind of see online is usually the thoughts that we have and don't express, right? There's a version of this, you know this. There's a lack of kindness towards people that disagree with you or see the world differently than you. Now, I love talking about this. Every 4 years, my life as a pastor gets so fun and interesting. I'll just tell you, like, this is my favorite time. So we're like a few months out before, like, we start really going in election mode. But I think this is one of the funniest things, is we are so good at being kind in the moment when we feel like we need to and we can get something. But the posture of kindness towards people who see the world differently or disagree with me or even more so hurt me, it is so fascinating. I am so good at not considering the needs of other people when I dehumanize them because of whatever our disagreement is or whatever they've chosen to do to me. Now, this is what makes this passage so interesting, and this is kind of what makes this passage hard, is you can read this and go, love is patient, love is kind. And most of us assume that generally we're patient enough and we're kind enough. but the embodiment of what it looks like to be a person who is both patient and kind, the centeredness that it takes, the submission to God that it takes. Come on, it's not about weakness. In fact, nowhere in the New Testament do you find that the weakness is a part of any of it. These people were not weak at all. Followers of Jesus were not weak at all. Jesus was not weak at all. It was not at all about that. It was strength through knowing how to move with a strength that changes the world. And so he's going like, love is patient, love is kind. The next part about it, it goes, who am I patient and kind to? Am I patient and kind towards people that hurt me? Yeah. Is my patience and my kindness towards people that have wronged me? To some degree, yeah. You see people laying down their life for people that did horrible things. You go, what is that? And it's not passivity. It's a deeply rooted strength within this patience and this kindness sort of thing. Now, it gives two, and this is what's fascinating about this passage. You get two, and then you got a list of like do nots, right? This is kind of fun. So love is patient, love is kind. Then it goes, you do not envy, right? It does not boast, and it is not proud. Now, if full transparency, I grew up where these three words meant almost the same thing, right? Proud and boastful, my mom would have used either one of those to describe what I did when I hit that home run. Like there's a little bit of those kind of things where it's just, this is ingrained in us. Envy is one of these things that's kind of wrapped into that, but they're very unique in the ways that they actually kind of flesh themselves out. So let me talk about envy first. Envy is one of these things that no one ever thinks they have until you look at your actual practices with other people. So let me tell you this. People who experience envy aren't just saying, hey, I want what you have. It's not what that's not what it is. Being envious of someone else, more times than not, flushes itself out when someone else is being celebrated or the spotlight is on them. And what I really want isn't just for them to fail. It's not that. I want the spotlight that is currently on them. Right? I don't feel threatened by the individual. I feel threatened by the thing that they have sort of that I'm wanting in those moments. And here's how you kind of know this. Have you ever met somebody who's a one-upper? Have you ever had one of these one-upper things? You ever done this? Like you told the best story about the best concert that you've ever been to. You ever had one of these moments? And it was like, it was so incredible and I got to do all these amazing things. Like, oh, well, I know Bono. And then that's where they leave it. And you're like, shut up. You know what I mean? Like a little bit of that. Like there's a little bit, or you have these moments where you talk about something in your career, or you talk about something where it went really well, and their initial response is to tell you how they've already gone there and done, and there's just a hint of condescension in there. And anybody ever felt condescended and got in a fight afterwards? Just me? No, just kidding. There's a little bit of that. You feel this, just kidding. But there's a little bit of this in the midst of it. And everything that they did is almost like, it's like they just one-upped you on the other side of it. You're like, I feel less than when I'm around you. Why is that? Why is it that it oftentimes, and you know this, people in our culture, it's not an envious of like, I want to grab whatever the thing is that you have. It's that I want to make you feel a little bit less than I am. I want to take just enough of that spotlight. And you know, there's something in you, if you're married with your spouse, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, where they've been so celebrated about something, and you know that the perfect spouse stands there and does this, and you do this, but in your heart, you're like, I mean, you see what I did? You know what I mean? A little bit of that. And it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard. It's a little bit of this. Have you ever accidentally one-upped your spouse in a story? Like they told you a great story and you don't respond with, wow, that was so great. What you did is you responded with, yeah, well, you know? Or we'll do this at our house. You guys are much better humans than I am, and I know this. My wife will have a great moment with one of our kids. I don't know if you've ever done this. I get a great moment. And then I will accidentally, and trying to relate sometimes, tell a story of the same thing happening to me. And she's like, thanks. You know what I mean? Like, thanks. There's a little bit of that. And you feel this, and it's so subtle. But over time, you know, what envy does, what these moments do, is they build. And they don't build even with your partner or your spouse and remembering what all of them are. They build in deposits of emotion, right? Intimacy is never, ever fueled by envy. It's just not. And so what happens is you have these little deposits of emotion over time. And what happens isn't that they stop loving you. That's not what happens. What happens is a timidity to share something that should be celebrated around you. And this is true with your friends. I mean, you know, your one-upper friend, it's not that you stop being friends most of the time. It's that you feel a little bit nervous to share something that matters to you with that person. Intimacy gets eroded. The same thing is true about the boastfulness. Boastfulness is interesting. It's not just talking about what you celebrate. It's the degree by which you talk about those things. And you know, if you were to look at your conversations with people, how much of it's about you versus how much of it is about your curiosity around the other person? You know, you don't gravitate to the friend who you spend an hour with, and at the end of it, they go, oh, yeah. How are you doing? You don't do that, right? Now, you might still be friends, but you don't wake up in the morning and go, you know who I get to hang out with today is the person who's going to talk the whole time. You don't do that. There's a piece of you, come on, you know this, that when you look at the sort of dance of the relationship, you go, there's a piece of you that goes, I also want to share it. Like, I also want to talk about that. Even the deepest introvert like I am, you know this. There's a dance to this. And so I'll tell you this, with your spouse, and I'll struggle with this, I'm an introvert everywhere else I go, except in my conversations with Emily. And then I just tell her everything. I will walk in the door after she's been with our 3 kids all day or whatever, and I will just go, hey, let me tell you about my day. You know what I mean? And it's just the whole thing. And we have to learn, and this is what I'm always learning, trying to be so curious in those relationships. And the last one is this. The last one is proud. And this is one where I would go, very few people would say that they're proud. Most of us would never, ever say that we're like proud in this way. But I'll tell you how this, I think, fleshes itself out. It fleshes itself out in your capacity to be vulnerable with people. And let me explain this. I came up, especially in church world, where everybody talked about authentic. Anybody ever talk about, you hear authentic all the time? Is this like, if you just be an authentic person, that sort of thing. Authentic's always funny, and I couldn't figure out why it bothered me. What I studied in college was, I studied like small groups and how people gather, and I studied theology and this sort of thing. And because I studied that, every book about this was like, how do you help people become authentic and talk about, their feelings? I was like, I never wake up and go, I want to talk about all my feelings in a small group. That's just never happened. But I think about like the authentic word. But the problem with authentic is you can be authentic and truthful and not vulnerable at all. Authenticity actually doesn't build bridges. Now, being a person who's inauthentic and fake, that's a different thing. It's not that. But what actually builds bridges in relationships is vulnerability. Vulnerability is the thing that actually causes intimacy to open up, and that's different than authentic. I can be real with you and also create a space where you don't have the capacity to hurt me at all. I can be authentic and have a deep wall between me and you. I can be authentic all day long and never give you the capacity to experience the inside version of my heart. And this is what's so interesting about this. The opposite of this proud sort of thing isn't just you being more real. You can be proud and real all day long. It is about, can you create a space or a bridge between you and other people? Now, come on, you know this. You know this too. For those of you who are leaders in the room, you know this. People will talk about wanting authentic leadership all the time. I think what they actually mean is wanting a leader who's willing to say, hey, here's the openness of both the weakness, struggle, and strength. Here I am. That's vulnerability. The vulnerability of saying, hey, I screwed this up. I actually screwed this up. I didn't talk about a weakness in a way where it's so distant that you have no way to get to me. I talked about a weakness where you could actually see this, and there's actually pain here. In a friendship that matters to you, you know this. You had the friend that became your friend because of your experiences. And then they became your friend because you enjoyed being around them and you had affinity to them. But they didn't become a 3 a.m. friend that you would call until there was some level of vulnerability in the relationship. And this is what's so fascinating about this. You can have friends that you've had for 30 years, 40 years, whatever it is, and not experience a level of vulnerability, and there's always some version of distance in the relationship. I talk to people who are married all the time, and you know this. The thing that eroded over time wasn't whether or not they were real or not, even though they should be real or authentic. It was their capacity to be vulnerable in the relationship. Vulnerability is what paves the way for a lot of the intimacy stuff that we talk about, right? And so you got envy, you got the boastful thing, you got the proud. And then the next word, I think, actually makes all of this a little bit harder in our context. We'll talk about it for a second. It says this. Love, or it, does not dishonor other people. Right. Now, when it comes to this, I want to talk about this in a couple of different ways. Dishonoring is one of these things that the opposite of this sometimes feel weird, right? Some of you have been a part of churches where there was like honor culture. Have you ever heard that phrase? Like there was an honor culture where there was like, hey, it's like whoever this person is a big deal. And I always laugh. I'm like, everybody can be elevated until they go get their first colonoscopy, and then we're all in the same boat together. Am I right? Like there's a little bit of that where it's like at the end of the day, we're all human when we go to the doctor. You know what I mean? Like there's a piece of that. Whoever it is that you're like, there's this honor thing. We're just like, whatever. There's like a false sense of that. And that's not at all what this text is talking about. There's not this like celebrity honor thing. It's not that at all. At the bones of this is going, the honor part of this is going, I am going to recognize that you are a human who was both created by God and loved by God. And I'm going to treat you as God has called me to treat you. No matter what the disagreement is, no matter what the difference in your humanness is, or whatever this is, I'm going to treat you with predetermined honor. Now, when you think about this in dating, I love, when I talk to people that are dating, this is always one of my favorite things. I was like, you're looking for somebody who deeply honors you as a person. When I talk to women about this, I'll say this. I was like, you want somebody who's honored you step by step through the friendship or the relationship where you don't wonder why they offered you another drink, right? You don't just wonder where the night's going, right? Or where you have to get up. That's not what it is. When it comes to this sort of thing, when it comes to honoring, you're not like worried about what their intentions are with you because they continue to honor you in a self-sacrificial kind of way, right? You get this when it comes to friendships as well, like honoring people when it comes to your relationships is going, I'm going to predetermine that I'm just going to choose to honor you on the other side of whatever that is. Now, I grew up in the South. Real quick, did anybody else grow up in the South other than me? I'm always curious. So you grew up in the South? Yeah. So I grew up like deep South, like South Carolina. And so I said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am as a kid. Anybody else, like your parents made you say that? Yeah. I learned that in the North, that can actually come off a little condescending. I said that to a 15-year-old at McDonald's the other day. I said yes, ma'am. And she looked at me like, are you okay? Like, you know what I mean? There's a little bit of that. So I get that. But what my mom did when I was a kid, I grew up in a single-parent home. And I'm not saying you should do this. So this is not prescriptive. This is very descriptive of how deeply ingrained the honor thing is with me growing up in our family. So when I was 5, 6, 7 years old in particular, my mom started teaching me to open the door for women when I was growing up. And I'll never forget this. It got a little interesting though, because you can picture it. My mom would drive. She didn't let me drive then. I was like 10 years old when I started driving in South Carolina. 49th in the nation education. No, anyway, so we did this, and I laughed though. As a kid growing up, it was normal in our house for me to walk around, open the driver's side door for my mom, and then get in the back seat. And then, yeah, I was gonna say that's cute. But there's a piece of this though where she was like about it. Let me tell you why. She was like this. And I get in the car, and she would say this all the time. She goes, "And you will honor every woman in your life." And it wasn't like it was like and you. There's a little bit of that. And I remember both being like, this is kind of dumb. And then you get like kindergarten, first, second grade, and you're like, I was the kid. Everybody else just hops in the car, and I'm like walking around the minivan, like, you're just kind of trying to hide behind the door, open the door. Yeah, he pictures that. And you go like, that was an extreme thing. And it was kind of an extreme thing. That is true. And at the same time, there was also something ingrained in me from like day one that you honor women. You honor other men. I'll never forget. I had coaches that would teach me this, right? As a little kid, you go like, you're honoring to your teammates, right? You're honoring to the people that you're with. You're honoring people that you're locked arms with. And then when I got a little bit older, and this was hard for me to learn early on, as I got a little bit older and I had people that were coming alongside of me teaching me about Christianity, then it was like, you're gonna honor the person who does you wrong. And it doesn't mean weakness, and it doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean you don't stand up for it. But you also honor the person who does you wrong. And I remember being like a 7th grader. And there was a guy who just did something, and it's just not great. I could tell you his name if you're watching right now. I'm just kidding. There's a little bit of that, right? And I remember coming back and men in my life sitting me down and going, hey, look, you're like 13-ish now. You're almost there. You're almost a man. And this is what it looks like to honor someone who wrongs you. And I'm like, but they don't deserve it, and da-da-da. And the predetermined honor piece of this was one of the things that separated Christianity in the early church world and made it stand out in a culture where the honoring thing was just not a part of it. You watch Jesus elevating women in a culture that didn't elevate women. He was honoring in a beautiful and powerful way. You watch people move through the early church and the ways that they honored all people, the way that they honored bad leaders, the ways that they honored the people. It wasn't passive. It was strength through selfless love. And so when you think about these things, you got the love is patient, love is kind, the envy, the boast, the proud pieces of this. When you look at all of this, it is setting you up as a human being to remove yourself as a part of someone else's regret story. Right? I put it in here like this. I said it this way. Imagine that you lived your life in a way where you were not a part of somebody else's regret story as a leader, as a spouse, as a friend, as a person who is trying to navigate through dating or these kinds of relationships, right? Now, when it comes to like your marriage, I'll just tell you this, right? Most people who stay married all the way through, the spouse doesn't communicate it in terms of regret, right? So you know this. I've told you this a lot of times. I still do this sometimes. I'll meet with people in their like 80s or 90s, like end of life stuff all the time. And you'll hear this. And I remember writing this down years and years ago about how people would talk about their spouse, right? What happens isn't like just an enormous amount of regret. That's really not usually what happens. What happens is you can hear affinity and affection in a spouse's voice when one spouse is gone or you don't. Isn't that fascinating? It's not that you even talk bad about them. Usually it's not even that. It's that you hear affinity and affection at the end of life when it comes to those relationships. And I'll never forget, I remember in my early 20s, I was writing this down. This is like a life goal for me when it comes to our marriage, is I want Emily, when I'm long gone, to be so glad she picked me, right? Because she picked me, and that's pretty obvious, right? There's a little bit of that. Like she could have, yeah. But I'm just saying, like, I want her to be so glad. And here's why that matters so much, ready? Because the commitment to our love and marriage can make it all the way through the end of our life. But the affinity and affection is a daily choice that we make, right? And so when it looks at it, you go like, it's not that she would just regret, it's that I want her to be so glad. Those of you who are dating, if you're dating in the room, and I'll tell people that are dating this all the time, I was like, whether you end up together or not, you are going to be a part of the story that person tells. You will. And you know this because you have these stories, right? Sorry, I just did this. I'm not talking about any of y'all. I'm just saying all of y'all, right? You know, you've been a part of somebody's story, and you know this. You have stories of people that you dated that you're on this side of it going like, I regret the day. And then some of you have stories of people that you dated and you go, it wasn't the right thing. But you still look back on it, and it's not regret. You look back on that and go like, okay, it wasn't the right thing, and that's over. Same thing with friendships. You know this too. Some of you have gotten through friendships, and it hasn't even been like betrayal, and it hasn't even been those kinds of things. But you get to the end of some of your friendships because you've outgrown them or you've moved on, those kinds of things, and you get to the end of it. And some people move through that and go, I regret ever having that relationship. And sometimes you go, it's not that I regret it. We moved on, those kinds of things. But like, I'm so thankful for that relationship, even though it's not like it used to be. And that's okay too. But you get to write that story now. Come on, for those of you who are leaders, I'll tell you this, and you know this. Those of you who are leaders in the room and leading people, all of that's a stewardship for however long you have that stewardship with those people. And most people, right, it is a temporary stewardship of leading whoever you're leading, right? And so I'm going to say, when those people leave and they go do whatever they're going to do, or when people leave whatever your organization is, or when people leave whatever it is that you're leading, come on, you know this. The story that they're going to tell is about the little micro decisions that you make along the way. And whether you embody what Paul is talking about here or not. And you've done this. You've left jobs before that you regretted ever walking in those doors. And then you've left jobs before that even though the work is different now and the pay is different now, you miss that job. All right, I'll tell you, this sits on a note card that is near my desk all the time. And I think about this. I want when people leave either our church or people leave our teams or whatever that is, I want them 10 years from now to go, I might love what I'm doing now, but I miss that thing, right? And as a leader, come on, that is a stewardship. It is a temporary stewardship that you have in your life. So Paul continues on. He kind of builds off of this dishonor idea. And here's what he says. He says, it does not dishonor others, talk about that, and it's not self-seeking. And then he talks about a secondary emotion, which I think is so fascinating. This is the part that I think is so interesting. He goes, it's not self-seeking, and it's not easily angered, right? Now, when you know, anger is always a secondary emotion. You just don't start with anger. Anger comes next, right? And whenever it comes next, right, there's usually something that's going on that's either unhealthy or something's happening over here. What Paul is doing, this is brilliant. He's going like, the healthiest people who embody love, have worked to fix the primary things that are going on here so that anger isn't the thing that bubbles up consistently. They're not easily angered. They're actually more centered. They are centered in all of this. They're making the healthy decisions and the primary emotions so that anger isn't the option that just bubbles up all the time, because these things feel so centered. And then I think he says after that, probably the hardest thing. He says this: it keeps no record of wrongs. Be really honest with me. Can we just be honest together? How many of you, when you see somebody, there's a small list that pops up next to their face of things that they've done? Anybody else do this? You know what I'm talking about? You know, it's almost like, you remember Minority Report? You guys remember Minority Report? I think it was like 90s maybe, where there's like a thing that popped up and there's like I was like, there are people. Like, we had somebody, I've told you this before, but like, there was somebody in Michigan where we were at that like dogged on one of our kids just for a second. Yeah. And then I went to prison after that, and it was great. I was kidding. But and I'll never forget this. For months afterwards, and yeah, I'd be nice, I'd do all this kind of stuff. For months afterward, the only thing I saw next to their face was what they said. And I was like, my kid's fine. They're moving forward. My wife was fine. I was the only, and every time I saw him, like, I would be nice, but all I could think about was that thing they said. I have people in my life, even like recently, I think about like, I remember something somebody said like 12 years ago. I was like, that's a long time to be low-key pissed about that. You know what I mean? Like, it's a long time to feel that, right? I'll never forget this. I'll never forget my 6th grade math teacher. That's a long time ago. You know what I mean? Like, that's a long time. But it's like, and we'll say things like this: I'll never forget. And then I'll tell you this: forgiveness isn't about the forgetting piece. I mean, you know this. It's not just about forgetting, but come on, the bones of this are going, I will not keep a record of wrongs against you. I'll let that book go for your own freedom. It is impossible to love the way that God has called you to love all people if you hold on to wrongs of some people. You just won't. You can't do it. You will not love your wife the way that you have been called to love her if you have not forgiven the people that have hurt you at work. You won't. You will not love your kids the ways that God has called you to love your kids until you can release the record of wrong from your own dad. You won't. You can't do it. It's a weight. It has gripped your heart. It has got its teeth in you to some degree. And you may do all of it well, but you will never do it to the degree that you could do it until you forgive and then forgive again and forgive again. And for many of you, it is a consistent forgiveness thing, right? It is a letting that book go on an hourly basis at times, right? It is a thing that you choose, and it is a choice to go, I will not keep that record of wrongs. I release you of the debt that you can never pay anyway. You couldn't give me those things back if you wanted to. I will release you of that debt. Now, the last part that we're going to look at here is one of the more powerful things I think that Paul says in this, and here's what he says. He goes on, he says this several verses later, but he says, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. And I love that this is connected to this passage. And I'll just be really blunt with you. This is where we're going to springboard off of from the rest of this series. Let me tell you this. You can be, 68 years old in here and still think and act like a child in your relationships. You can be 26 and still think and act like a child when it comes to your relationships. You can be whatever age you are and not progress through the difficult parts of maturity that are difficult to progress through. Come on, you know this. In almost every tension in your current relationships, it is a nuanced thing of something you experienced early. Envy is something you experienced early. Being proud is something that you experienced early. Dishonor is something that I experienced as soon as I could learn how to talk, right? There's something about that, you know what I mean? Any sassy kids in the room? Just come on, let's be honest, yeah. You're just sitting next to your mom. Yes, sorry. Yeah, there's a little bit of that, yeah. Like, come on, you know, those things you experience young, and they become more and more nuanced. But come on, let's say, what the New Testament teaching is around this is that followers of Jesus move, and they progress, and they do it through the power of the Holy Spirit working in their lives, and they do it through their own discipline, and they do it by the discipline of saying, I am going to choose to submit, to predetermine and submit my life to what you've called me to do in these places. I'll say this, for those of you in the room, we'll hit them all, but like, if you're married in the room, this is one of those things that's going, you might have a good marriage, but the healthy marriage is you creating vulnerability even when it's hard. And that's a discipline. That's a discipline for me, right? That's a discipline. For those of you, when it comes to your friendships, it is a discipline. It is a discipline for you to apply the not self-seeking part, to apply the envy part, to apply all those things to your friendships. I tell people this, they're dating all the time. And, it makes me sound like I'm Leave It to Beaver, 1950s, all that kind of, I totally get it. But I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to say, when you're dating someone, when you look at the patience piece of this, when you look at the sexual ethic that's given in the New Testament, when you look at all of these places, this is so fascinating. It is going, I handle the most powerful parts of a relationship, right, when it comes to these places, with submission to Jesus. Why? Because I don't want to be a part of somebody's regret story. I don't want to do that. I want to protect intimacy, whatever that takes. And you know this, intimacy is only fueled through exclusivity and vulnerability. When I tell people all the time, it's like, people go like, I hear this every day. What's the, like, don't have sex before marriage? This is always like a thing that pops up, and I always think it's funny. It's like, I teach the same thing on it every time. It's not like, I wonder what Patrick thinks. Like, I teach the same thing on it every time. And everybody goes like, I joke about this. I'm going, people think it's because the Bible says so. Yeah, whatever. But if you loved your kid, and you know this, and you loved your kid, and you didn't want them having a regret story, when you know this, you would say, hey, this is one of the most powerful things that you'll ever experience in your life. So of course, a loving father, don't miss this, would look at you and say, hey, there is something designed to house the most powerful part in some ways of that relationship. Why would you want to risk it? Why would you want to risk that? Why would you want to do that? You're like, oh, it's so 1950s. And I go, yeah, but what's hard for me is like almost every regret story that I hear involves some version of that. Some of you know this. Some of you are like this now. You're like, I have a series of regret stories around it. And I go, you stop. There's a reason that God has said, hey, this is designed here. And it's not for you to not have pleasure. It's so that you can experience it to its fullest capacity. You go, man, that sounds like, I'm like, and it works. And so I go like, oh, that's one tiny area. I think the same thing when it comes to leadership. I think about this all the time. It feels so counterintuitive to be the kind of leader that goes, this is a temporary stewardship, and I will elevate other people. If other people get promoted, I'm going to work to not feel threatened. When I feel threatened, I am going to publicly and powerfully celebrate other people. You see all these things. I'm going to do that. I'll be the biggest champion of those things. That feels counterproductive, and it feels like you go, no, I'm going to do that. Honoring is the other one. Come on, again, this year, every one of us is going to be tempted to be dishonoring to somebody who says something wildly stupid at Thanksgiving. Come on, can we just be really honest? Uncle whoever is going to say it, and you're going to sit there, and every part of you goes, it's not that I'm going to argue the point. I'm going to make him feel less. And every part of you is going to want to do that. Now, don't miss this. But the countercultural piece of this, the part of the thing that makes Christianity so irresistible is to refuse to be that person. I am not going to be that person. I am going to choose to honor even the people that I don't even feel like are worth honoring. Why? Because I predetermined submission to Jesus in that area. And so, here's where we're going to go over the course of the next few weeks. We're going to take this idea, and the idea is this. Let's go to the next one real quick. The question around this is, are you the person that you wish others to be? And when it comes to this thing, here's what I'm going to have you think about. The next few weeks, we're going to talk practically about how you do this in specific kinds of relationships. Some of you are empty nesters in the room, and you're just really honest. You're like, my relationships with my adult kids, they suffer, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with that. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about it from both perspectives. Some of you are in a dating relationship, and you're like, we're trying to figure this out. How do we do that? Some of you are married. Some of you are engaged. We're going to talk about those kinds of things. Friendship, we're going to spend some time talking about. We're going to talk about all these kinds of things. Leadership, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about over this series. But I'm just going to tell you this. There's so many practical pieces to it. And if you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, I'm going to tell you, you can apply all the practical stuff that we have in your own strength, right? And that's kind of what this is. And I get that. I think it'll also be helpful. But for those of you who are followers of Jesus, it is twofold. It is acknowledging what these practical things are that we're going to talk about. But first, saying, I want to be submitted and predetermined to be submitted to what Jesus is teaching me here. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes just for a second. And I'm going to ask you just to spend a moment to reflect. And if you're here and not a follower of Jesus, I want you to reflect on this question. Which one of those relationships is a relationship that feels like you need to focus on a little bit? Is it a spouse? Is it dating? Is it a friendship? Is it leadership? Whatever it is. I want you to think about those things. I'm going to ask you to ask yourself this question this week, right? Asking yourself this question, are you the person that you wish other people to be? But if you're here and you're a follower of Jesus, here's what I'm going to ask you to do, and this is what we're going to pray together, is I'm going to ask you to invite Jesus to help you see these relationships in the ways that he would call you to see them. Before we ever get to all the practical things, I'm going to ask you to simply pray this prayer internally and just go, Jesus, will you help me to see other people the way that you would have me to see them and treat them the way that you would have me to treat them? So, Father, we ask as a starting point for the next few weeks, as just a launch pad for where we're going. For those of us who are followers of you in the room, God, I ask that you would help us to invite you to help us figure this out. We pray that you would, in even beyond natural kind of ways, in the moments when we're tempted to do what feels natural sometimes, God, you would correct us in those moments in our hearts and in our minds. You would move us in the direction we need to go. God, you would help us to start asking the question and be intentional about it. And we wouldn't be passive in our relationships, but we would be intentional about these things. And I pray for the person who is curious about faith or trying to figure this out or just trying to navigate some of these questions, even on their own right now. And what I ask is that as we look at what you teach over these next few weeks when it comes to our relationships, God, that there would be something about these principles that would both help them, sure, but also illuminate your power within it. And I pray that you would help them to apply this as well. And that as they take these steps, that all of our relationships would get better. But even more than that, you would help us to be partners with you in creating the world that you want us to create. And being a part of the people who bring redemption into the broken places.